Welcome to the Third Decade Podcast, where we believe every young adult deserves the confidence to take control of their financial future. Whether you're just getting started or you're well on your way towards financial independence, we're here to give you the tools and guidance you need to build a life that aligns with your dreams. Let's turn financial uncertainty into opportunity. Together.
Hey Third Decade community, I'm your host Nikita Wolf, and today I am joined by Third Decade's volunteer mentor, Adam Van Deusen. Thanks so much for being here with us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Nikita.
So today's topic, I'm pretty excited to talk about. I think every topic that we've been covering lately, I'm feeling like I might glean something personally as well. But we are going to be discussing how money and happiness, intersect with each other. Can money buy happiness, and what the influencing factors are on that? So I'm excited for that.
Yeah, me too. It's, you see lots of articles and headlines around that says that you need this much money or that much money. So I think it's really interesting to sort of dive into the research and see what it says.
Yeah, I'll use that as a natural segue. So, we all wonder, they say money can't buy happiness. In some ways, it seems like maybe it can. So is that true? What does the research say?
Yeah, so, this is something that researchers have looked at for a long time, although, it comes with the caveat that, individual preferences are going to come into play here as well. A lot depends on the individual person, and no two people's experiences are going to be alike. That said, there's been some interesting research done. So a very famous study that came out several years ago by Kahneman and Deaton said that happiness seemed to increase up to about $75,000 of income and plateaued from there, which was a big finding. I got lots of headlines, things like that. But some subsequent research by a researcher named Matthew Killingsworth, he came out and he redid the study. He looked at some different questions in some different areas and actually found that happiness did not, in fact, plateau at $75,000, but it kept going up beyond then. Though, as we can talk about, there are some sort of key factors that come into play, especially when it gets to higher income levels.
Yeah, and I wonder, too, what year did you say this study was, or do we know exactly what year?
Yeah, the newer one was a few years ago, and then I might get into it, but then the two sets of authors ended up working together on a third study that they took each of their sides and then found some new results as well.
Oh, very cool. Yeah, because I was going to ask, like that $75,000 number, I remember hearing that maybe 6 or 7 years ago. Obviously, things have changed a lot. $75,000 in 2018 does not get you what it does today in 2025. So I'm curious maybe where that number lies. But do you want to talk about that third study and maybe what some of those findings were?
Yeah. And so the third study, they sort of put all their heads together. And what they found actually was they agreed with the second study's findings that money or that happiness did tend to increase over time or as income rose. But there were some key factors to it. And it happened to do in large part to an individual's sort of personality or temperament. So they found that up to, I believe it's about the $75,000 starting at sort of very low levels of income, any additional income increases happiness. So you could imagine if you were, housing insecure or food insecure, just having a little bit of money, no matter what your temperament, is going to increase your happiness because you're able to meet your basic needs.
Right.
But let's say you're going up the income ladder, past that 75,000, 100,000 level. So all of your basic needs are hopefully met at this point. It's at that point when individual personalities come into play. So, for example, they found that individuals with a general happy, positive personality, their happiness tended to improve as income increased, perhaps in part to their being able to find, happiness boosting ways to use that money. Maybe it helped them go on a vacation or see their loved ones more often, whatever it is. But for people who sort of had a more negative temperament, the additional money had much, much less of an effect. Another key factor here as well was the amount of free time an individual has during their day. So individuals who are able to say that, I have control of my time during the day, they were much more likely to see that happiness boost from increased income compared to those who didn't. And so I think that fact really comes into play when we're thinking about, maybe I'll take this job that's going to increase my income, but I'm going to have to work, 10, 20 hours more per week, or my commute is going to be 2 to 3 hours longer. That's a serious trade-off where the increased money you might get might not be worth it if it means you're losing time for other things that you might do.
Yeah, that totally makes sense because I feel like I've seen people who are, acquaintances of mine and I know roughly what they make and I'm like, how are you still feeling so miserable making like, some of them over like 250K. And it's a really interesting perspective for I guess viewpoint on how are those people generally? Like, are they like maybe not optimistic is the wrong word, but what's their general outlook on life? Like, are they positive? That's definitely gonna have a factor. Why don't we talk about maybe the different types of happiness?
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. So, and a lot of it, good point, because in this research, they look at two different types of happiness. There's what you might call your day-to-day happiness. So a question they might ask on a survey is, thinking about your last day, how would you rate your happiness on a scale of 1 to 10? Or just right now, where would you rate your happiness on a scale of 1 to 10? And what's interesting is they do this over time. One of the studies used trackers that buzzed people like on your phone at random times over the course of the week. It was like, how happy do you feel now? How happy do you feel now? And that sort of put that together. But then there's also sort of the broader happiness, what you might refer to as life satisfaction. So the question here is that, all things considered, how happy are you overall with your life situation? And as you can imagine, you're going to have different answers on both of those, depending on sort of what both your income is, but other things that are going on in your life. So, for example, if you have young children, the day-to-day level of happiness might be a little bit lower than it was when you were, single and able to have much more control of your time. But perhaps that life satisfaction element might be really higher because you're getting a lot of pride in your children or a sense of accomplishment of, raising them and seeing them. So it's important, I think, to look at both of those elements. And if you're just thinking in your own personal situation, for listeners now, you might say to yourself, which one of these do I feel higher on? Or maybe I want to try to give a boost to one side or another.
Yeah, that's really interesting to think of it that way. And it's funny that you bring up the, people who are parents and life satisfaction. I feel like I'm experiencing that as we speak, where I'm like, generally in life, I feel great, but man, I miss my free time in the evenings.
Yeah, so, it's tough when kids are yelling in diapers and things like that. Yeah. It's tough to have that day to day, but like I said, the broader payoff can potentially happen too.
Definitely. So I'm sure that it also depends on how people spend their money. I think some people maybe are just like, it's almost like impulsive, like mindless spending and aren't necessarily trying to spend in like a values-based way. Does the research say anything maybe about how you spend your money, like how that impacts this?
Yeah, and so it's actually a different group of researchers have really dug into this question about, what brings happiness. And of course, everyone's looking for sort of one sort of big answer. There's a really great book that came out several years ago called Happy Money, The Science of Spending. So we'll put that in the show notes. But, that identified sort of several areas that they found that tended to bring greater happiness to individuals. And you often find this in that latter sort of life satisfaction happiness category. So one that a lot of people will probably have heard before is the idea that spending on experiences often brings greater happiness than spending on things, that you might say. And so you've probably heard that before. So, for example, going on a vacation with friends might bring you greater happiness than, a new piece of clothing or, buying I don't want to date myself with buying a CD, but buying a CD or some sort of subscription or something like that. So in general, I would say, experiences over things. Though, interestingly, there was some additional research done that they looked at sort of the wide variety of things that you could purchase. So all the experiences and all the sort of tangible things that you could buy. And what's interesting is what they found is a lot of what you might think of a thing can often bring significant happiness, particularly if it enables an experience. So, for example, a good example of this is buying a tennis racket. So the tennis racket itself is a thing, but it's enabling you to have the experience of being able to play tennis with your friends. You might think of a board game. Some falls in a similar category. It's a thing, but it's enabling that experience. So all in all, in this category, I would say prioritizing things that bring an experience, that bring you together with other people, often brings more happiness than sort of a thing that you're primarily enjoying by yourself.
I'm glad you sort of put that to words because I feel like I've experienced that in recent years where I'm like, I'm like, I don't, I'm not a spendy person, but I feel like I've been buying things that I'm like, this is making my life easier. And then I never regret it. Like I'm not buying again mindlessly, but I'm like, they are still things. And it feels like it's in a way, I guess, making me happier, but not because of having the thing, but because of what it does. So that is really helpful that you put it that way. That is definitely what's happening. So interesting.
Yeah. And that's a really good segue to a second category, which is the idea of buying yourself time. So this is the idea of perhaps you hire a house cleaner to come clean your house, and that saves you a few hours of an activity that you may not enjoy. So that's a good way that especially if you're busy, maybe you have like work, kids, everything else going on, you want a few hours for your own, activities. The house cleaner could be a really good purchase. It's buying you that time, and they found that often brings happiness, particularly if it's an activity that you don't like. Some people like cleaning, so then maybe it's mowing the lawn or whatever it is. But finding ways to give yourself more free time, especially if you're a very busy person, that kind of spending ended up working out well too.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So why don't we talk about how money kind of reduces stress? Once we're able to cover the basics, immediately we're seeing like a life satisfaction improvement, right?
Yeah, exactly. So right, we've got the basics covered. And so what was interesting, some of the first research I was discussing got into was the increase in your happiness with your income. They interact, you might say, logarithmically. So, for example, a doubling of your income would double your happiness. So, just an example of this. So, moving from, let's say, $20,000 of income to $40,000 of income gives you the same happiness boost as moving from, say, $100,000 of income to $200,000 of income. So as you go up the income ladder, you need more income in dollar terms to get that same happiness boost. So that's why a lot of the gains are made fairly low on the income spectrum, because and that makes sense, right? If you have $30,000 and somehow you win $1,000 in a contest or something like that, you're going to be able to have many more ideas, and that's going to make a much bigger difference in your life than if you earn $200,000 and you just get $1,000 extra. You're like, well, that's nice, but in comparison,
It
it's not a big
necessarily
deal.
feel life changing.
As big of a deal. And again, this goes back to that previous conversation that as you move up the income spectrum, you really can make that calculation in terms of your time and the increased income you're expecting, because the increase to your happiness might not be clear.
So whenever you start, let's say you now are making a lot more money. Sometimes we see people's lives maybe take a turn. Like they end up saying like, man, I regret not keeping the job that paid $60K a year because now I'm making 200 and I'm feeling terrible and I don't have time and things like that. What are some of the things that impact people's decrease in life satisfaction once they start making more money?
Yeah. So a big one on that, again, it's the time element, like feeling in control of your time. So, whether it's the hours of work per week, whether it is you're adding your commute time onto that, other obligations that you have, that can be a big detriment if you don't feel you have free time or you're just all over the place all the time. So I would say this goes, I think, is one of the key points to get across is that it's always good to check in with yourself, like seeing where you are. Maybe you're advancing within your company to a position and you're like, wow, this has brought, money and status, whatever as it is, but something doesn't feel right inside because, I'm not able to, go out on the weekend with my friends as much or to head to happy hour in the evenings because I'm, stuck at work or whatever. So, anytime you're thinking of sort of a life transition, it's not always as black and white as I'm going to make more money, therefore it's better, because there are a lot of other factors that can come into play.
Yeah. I know I have a story, a friend of a friend that I would like to share, but I kind of want to give you the chance to share a story first, if you have any that you would like to, of maybe somebody who has, I guess, maybe positive or negative, like either had a huge increase in their life satisfaction with more income or maybe a decrease because some of the other things weren't being kept in check.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you one of the examples you'll often hear is about the happiness of lottery winners, right? So they go from making whatever income they had and whatever wealth they had built up to all of a sudden having significant wealth that they could use to generate a much higher income. If you invest it, you can get the investment returns. But, and some of the research on this is contentious, but often you find that the person's baseline level of happiness is often what they return to. So, if my life satisfaction was a 5 and my daily satisfaction was a 5, when you first win the lottery, maybe it goes up to 7 or 8, but over time it tends to come back down again to this baseline level. And this is the sort of the point you were getting at before, which is that once you have the basics met, your happiness is often determined sort of by your base personality and view and outlook on life, more so than the amount of money that's in your bank account. So oftentimes finding ways to find greater meaning, find greater enjoyment can be a bigger investment than getting direct cash, as it were, whether it's winning the lottery or getting a higher salary.
I wonder how quickly that adaptation happens. Just the hedonic treadmill in general, because I'm sure they're kind of related in a way.
Yes, that's exactly right. The hedonistic adaptation that you kind of return your baseline shifts, and you often see that with folks. Like maybe you've said that to yourself before. Let's say you make $30,000 a year right now, and you're like, oh, if I could make $50,000 a year, I would be set, because maybe you have, financial goals or, bills you want to pay, things like that. But then you get to the 50,000 and you're like, oh, if I got to 75,000, then I'd be set. Then I'd be happy. And sort of the goalposts keep moving for a couple of reasons. One is that, you get used to a certain level and maybe you want more. But secondly, you also get into the idea of absolute versus relative income. So your absolute income, what you have, 50,000, whatever it is, but relative income to other people. So, if I make 50,000 and I see my friend making 75,000, it can be tempting to be like, oh, I'd really like their lifestyle. So that's something else that can come into play too.
Yeah, I think you start comparing yourself to different people, to be honest.
Yeah, it's hard. And, as someone who's in the personal finance world all the time, that is one of the biggest secrets to success. It's so hard to do. But if you can, there's a phrase, play your own game or run your own race, as it were. If you can focus on what you need and for your interest and not comparing yourself to the others, you often end up in a much better financial situation because you're spending on the things that are most important to you and things like that. And perhaps for happiness as well, because you're achieving your own personal goals rather than trying to, meet the goals or meet the status that a friend has or that you think people expect of you.
Yeah.
But I'd be interested, what was your example of sort of the increased wealth and happiness?
Yeah. So I have a friend whose friend is like an executive with one of the really big tech companies. I'll keep as many details under lock and key as I can. But I would ballpark that he's probably making about $500,000 a year, and recently started a family maybe a couple of years ago. And to my surprise, I learned that he's like not doing well. Like he's not enjoying himself. And I think it's exactly that golden handcuffs thing where it's like he's not getting to have that time at home with young children, and time goes very quickly whenever you have littles at home. And he can buy it all. He could outsource all of the things. Yeah. But at the end of the day, if you have to work 60, 70, 80 hours a week, potentially, there's not a lot you can do to actually enjoy the life you're living. You can have the fancy house and the nice car and feel like everything on the outside looks very good. But I would wager to say I'm making a small fraction of what he makes, and I'm probably happier, and I have the crummy car and the very mediocre house and things like that, where it's just like you kind of get caught in the rat race a bit. And so that was surprising to me to learn that somebody making that much money could possibly not have like outsourced their woes in a way to, find a way to be content in life. And it's sad. I'm chuckling a little bit about it just because that concept breaks my brain a little bit, thinking about what my life would look like if I made that much. But I think it also shows the humanity in all of us and how we really do start comparing ourselves to other people and kind of get caught in other cycles of things. And I know some people, once they start breaking into like, 6 figures, 200K as an individual, they start buying nice things, and they end up still feeling like they're a little bit living paycheck to paycheck because now the cars they're financing are the $100,000 cars rather than the $35,000 cars and things like that. So as humans, we kind of, I think we keep ourselves a little bit in a cycle that, like you said, sort of returns us back to our baseline level of happiness. So.
Yeah, no, that's a really good example. And it touches on, that was perfect because it touched on so many of the points here. The things versus experiences, having the house and the car, those are good examples of things. Now, it could be the kind of thing that brings happiness. Like if you buy a house that has space because you have friends over all the time or family over for parties, or they, stay with you over the holidays, that's perhaps a way to turn the thing into an experience.
Yeah.
But if you're buying this more expensive house because your friend has the house that's just a little bit smaller and you want one that's just a little bit bigger, that's perhaps the kind of thing that isn't going to bring that lasting happiness in there. And, car's a good example too. I heard about a study the other day that they found that, you buy a new car, it feels great, for a while, and then you kind of get used to it, right? You're like, oh, this is what I drive every day. But they found that one exception to this is people who buy cars and join car clubs. Maybe it's a certain brand or, an antique cars or something like that, because now you're turning that thing purchase into a much more social event, right? You're taking it and you're hanging out with other people who have a similar interest and you're all doing it together. So I think that's an interesting way too of something that's one of the more commonly thought of as things, of turning that into an experience. Of course, you'd want to have to join the car club as it is, but
the first car that comes to mind is like Jeeps. I recently learned like a year ago, there's a whole culture with them, apparently.
Oh, yes. Right. They have meetups. I think there's like the Wave, I think, that they do. So yeah, that's a really good example.
I don't understand all of it, but yeah.
Yeah. To get into that culture, that's a potential way to turn that sort of into an experience.
So I know one of the ways that people might not necessarily think about, using their money to increase their happiness, but definitely has an impact, is generosity. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and going back to the Happy Money book, this was another area that they found would bring increased happiness, which is being generous and giving to others. Whether it's people in need, or to different charitable organizations that you find valuable. When you do that, people came away with stronger feelings and stronger happiness. And this again is probably more in the life satisfaction bucket, but there's two elements to this. One is the positive feeling of helping others, and especially causes that are important to you. There has been some other research too, is that people who give money away, no matter what their wealth level, actually feel wealthier. But I think the idea here is that psychologically you're telling yourself, well, hey, if I can afford to give this money to this charitable cause, I must be doing pretty well off. So it's good for psychological purposes, both in terms of generosity, but also in terms of your feeling confident and in terms of your own financial situation.
That is really interesting. Yeah. I also find it fascinating that and maybe a little bit more on this, I'm deviating a little, but oftentimes people who make a little bit less money are more generous with it than people who are making maybe not substantially more, because obviously, and perhaps it should be looked at more in terms of like percentage of income than like dollar amount. But somebody making 100K is maybe less likely to give than someone making 40K. Do you know anything about that? I know I'm throwing that out of left field, but I know I've heard that, and I guess what I've seen in life, actually, that checks out. But I don't know why.
Yeah, I think there's a few things at play here. Some of the studies on generosity have shown people up and down the income spectrum are generous and give, which is, I think, really great to see. And so, I think sometimes there's a nexus here with involvement in religious organizations. I mean, I know a lot expect, maybe you're donating a certain percentage of your income, something like that. So that's one way to get that bucket going. But also, sometimes it's gratitude both ways. People who received, assistance when they were at a tougher part of their life are more willing to give more, now that they've moved up a little bit in the world. In the world of folks with higher incomes and wealth, instead of charitable giving, it's often called philanthropy when you're at those really high levels. And so you do see a lot. I mean, people give. There are many generous people who have high wealth and high income there. Though I would say across the wealth spectrum, I think something that's interesting to me is a lot of people are saying, well, I don't want to give now because I'm not sure I have enough money, but I'll give to charitable causes like when I pass away, right? And so, sometimes you'll read in the newspaper, this person died and left a $1 million donation to this organization or that organization. And well, that's terrific. I mean, to be willing to give that much money away as opposed to maybe giving it to a family member or something like that. It also brings up the idea of, well, maybe giving during your lifetime could have been very effective as well, for a couple of reasons. One is that, just today, there are no shortage of charitable causes that could put the money to good use that you have right at the moment. But something I think is underrated too is you being able to see that organization benefit and seeing the results of the giving that you made, whether you're giving $50 or $5 million, whatever it is, you're able to see that today and then get that sort of happiness boost that you have at the moment. So, and I think that's why they found if you are able to give, and of course you want to make sure it's within your means. And so, and of course that's not to plug Third Decade, but that's a really great conversation I have sometimes with Third Decade participants is, hey, we want to be able to give to these organizations. How does that fit within our financial plan? And as a mentor, that's one of the things that we talk about is, hey, right now this might be what you're looking at, but as your income increases, maybe you're starting, as you said, a percentage. Let's make a goal of 5% of our income or 10 or 15%, whatever it is, as our income and wealth grow. That can be a great way to make giving a habit over time.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So I know that I sort of mentioned values-based spending earlier and didn't really necessarily describe that.
Yeah.
Could you kind of break that down for somebody who maybe hasn't listened to our episode about values-based spending, what we mean when we say that?
Yeah, and this kind of goes into the idea of, people hear the word budget or, a spending or savings plan, and it sounds, scary. It sounds like a whole lot of no fun. But the idea here, though, is when you're able to track your spending and see what categories you're spending in and what items you're spending in, that gives you a window into whether you're spending your money in the ways that most align with your values and what's most important to you. So, for example, the first time you do this, you look at all your spending over a month, and if you can do it over a couple months, that's even better. But you'll say, hey, you can start with the easy stuff. Like there's this music subscription that I have. I don't even listen to it, or I listen to it once a month. Like, that's the kind of thing that it's not a high value for me. So let's cross it off. And I've opened up a little bit more room for spending. But then perhaps there are some bigger items there. It's like, maybe a few years ago, I bought the expensive car and it's, not bringing me much more happiness than I had when I had the car that cost a whole lot less. But whereas there might be another area I value, a lot of my friends are getting married over the next couple years, and I really want to go to their weddings all over the country. So, but I don't think I have enough room in my budget to do that. Well, maybe here's a trade opportunity, right? You maybe you're able to sell and downgrade the car to open up some cash that you're able to put towards this item that you value the most. So taking the time to think about that, whether by yourself or with the help of a Third Decade financial mentor or a friend or anyone else, can be a really good practice to ensure that you're spending on the areas that are most valuable to you and perhaps align with some of this research into what's most likely to bring you greater happiness boosts over time.
Yeah, and you can also look, if you're finding that you're overspending on your income especially, and you look at where your expenses currently lie, you can very easily make decisions of, okay, what's got to go? What truly improves my life and what doesn't? What do I feel good spending on and what do I not?
Right.
So yeah, thanks for breaking that down.
Right. And, this goes to there's a famous idea called the latte. People talk about this, right? If you cut out the fancy coffee, you'll be able to save so much money and it's going to grow over time. And so there's a lot of controversy over it in terms of, how much of an effect it has. But I think it's a good example at least in this values-based spending conversation. So is your value is getting that fancy coffee something that you really, really enjoy? And it's like that much of a happiness boost over over, let's say, making coffee at home. For some people, that might be the case. And so that's probably something that's worthwhile to continue spending on because it's something that really is bringing you just a little bit of extra happiness every day. Whereas you could think of perhaps there's other people for whom they're only getting the coffee out at the, out at a restaurant or at a coffee shop for the convenience factor, right? And maybe if they just spent 2 extra minutes at home making their coffee, it tastes the same to them either way. Maybe that 2-minute investment to make it at home could be worth it if it frees up, $50, $100 a month that they could be using for something that they value more. So I think of the idea of, taking out the coffee or restaurants or whatever that category is for you, less of a way to, in the quick way to grow your wealth and more of getting back to this values conversation of really trying to spend on the things that are most important for you.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think let's wrap up, unless there's anything else you wanted to touch on, kind of recap maybe what we discussed today. So like we said, money can increase happiness whenever it is used to reduce your stress, increase your freedom, and just support your joy and things you enjoy doing in life. Do you have any suggestions maybe for our listeners as far as things they could do to put this into practice?
So there's a few things. I think one is sort of the exercise we just talked about. If you're able to track your spending over the course of a couple of months, there's a lot of apps and that you can do, or you can do it manually, like on a spreadsheet or even a piece of paper. But just seeing in front of you exactly what you're spending on might be surprising. I didn't realize I was spending, $200 a month eating out when it's not that important to me. Or, for example, in that category, maybe you start to prioritize eating out when you're eating out with friends, which is, again, kind of a social activity that's more likely to bring happiness than sort of the, ordering in when it's just like I just don't feel like cooking tonight kind of thing. That's a potential trade-off that could, shift your spending and open up money for other areas. I think that's a good one. One of the other ones is, especially when you're thinking about making a major purchase. So the biggest expenses for most people are things like housing, transportation. Those are often the two big ones. So, if you're thinking about, maybe you're thinking about moving to a nicer apartment or maybe buying a house. So really you want to think closely because this is going to impact your wealth and your cash flow for a long time. So think about, am I buying this house because it looks nice and I can't wait to, post pictures of it all the time? Or is it maybe it's closer to my work? Or it's going to have, it's just big enough to make things more comfortable for me and my family. That could be a different consideration. Similarly with the car. Is this something that I'm going to use in a social experience way? Or is it sort of a status type thing? That's a big difference because it's going to make a big difference over the course of your, the weeks and months and years. And then, the other thing I would say is going back and thinking about the idea of giving. So, finding opportunities to be generous and as well, finding opportunities where you can buy time. Is there something that just really bothers you that you could pay to not have to deal with? Whether it's cleaning, maintenance, whatever it is, especially if you have a busy schedule. Otherwise, that could be a way to use your money to sort of generate and buy happiness or buy time that can lead to greater happiness.
Yeah, totally. Something you said maybe a minute or so ago about taking a picture of the house and posting it to social media. It's interesting to think of it that way. And I honestly, maybe I'll go on a little tangent here. I think maybe it's good to evaluate a lot of the purchases that you make under that lens. Like if we reversed 50 years and did not have the internet and no one else got to see what you did, like, would you still be buying it? Would you, if it was just you that got to enjoy it and see it and appreciate it, would you still do it? And maybe that's another good lens to look at your purchases through. So.
Yeah, that's a great point.
I really appreciate you coming on for today's episode. And as Adam said, we will include everything any resources for this episode in our show notes. So you can look there for links to those items. And if this episode stood out to you and you want to share it with a friend, please do that. So appreciate your time, Adam.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Nikita.
Thank you for joining us on the Third Decade Podcast. Remember, building your financial future isn't just about dollars and cents. It's about empowering yourself to live the life you want. If today's episode gave you new insights or inspired you to take action, we'd love for you to share it with someone who could benefit. Together, we can turn financial uncertainty into opportunity. Until next time, let's continue to embrace the journey ahead and take control of your financial future.